Ever walked into a situation and found yourself sort of mirroring the behavior of everyone else without even thinking about it?
Oh, definitely. Like adjusting your tone in a meeting, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Or, feeling that pull to join a crowd, a protest for something you believe in.
Right. And think about huge figures like, say, Malala Yousafzai or Martin Luther King Jr., the way they influenced people shifted whole societies.
Absolutely massive influence. Okay, let's unpack this because, well, at the core of all that is this really fascinating field, social psychology.
Yeah, what's truly captivating is just how much our own thoughts, our actions, the things we think are just us. How much they're actually guided by, well, the social world around us. Subtly, sometimes not so subtly.
Mm-hmm. Those examples, like fitting in style-wise or joining a movement, they really show those invisible forces, don't they? How others affect us.
They really do.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're doing a deep dive into the fundamentals of social psychology. We've got some great materials looking at definitions, its basic nature, its history.
And how it connects to other fields, other ways of understanding behavior.
Right. So the mission here is to get a really clear picture. What is social psychology? What are its key characteristics? And importantly, why does it matter in our everyday lives?
And if you step back, understanding this isn't just academic, it gives you a lens, a powerful one, to see those often hidden forces shaping how you perceive things, how you feel, the choices you make socially.
Which seems incredibly useful just for navigating life, relationships, making sense of things.
Definitely valuable.
So, okay, let's get down to brass tacks. How do we actually define social psychology? Our sources give a couple of really good ones. Casson, Fain, and Marcus. They describe it as the scientific study of how we feel, think, and behave towards other people. And crucially, how all that is influenced by the social context.
Right, the context is key there. And then you have Gordon Allport's definition.
Yeah, Allport puts it slightly differently, but it fits right in. He calls it the scientific discipline, trying to understand and explain how our thoughts, feelings, behaviors are influenced by the actual imagined or even just the implied presence of others.
So what jumps out at you most from those definitions?
For me, honestly, it's that imagined or implied presence that just, wow, it means someone doesn't even have to be there.
Exactly.
They can still affect what we do just by us thinking about them or thinking about what they think. We sort of carry these influences in our heads.
It's a profound point, isn't it? It really shows how deep social norms and expectations go. They shape our inner thoughts, guide us, even when we're alone.
Yeah.
But let's not skip over that scientific part either. That's crucial. This isn't just, armchair philosophizing.
Right. It's not just casual observation. It's rigorous, evidence-based.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack that scientific method aspect more. The materials highlight three main things that make it scientific. First, it relies on systematic observation, description, and measurement.
So it's not just a hunch. It's about collecting data, actual data, that others can check, can replicate. Verifiable stuff.
Yeah, moving away from just gut feelings or anecdotes.
Exactly. The strength is in forming ideas you can actually test, and then testing them properly through research. The goal is really threefold. Describe social behaviors accurately, explain why they happen, and, if possible, predict when they might occur again.
So forming hypotheses, testing them, observing, experimenting.
That's the core of it.
Okay, second key ingredient, the focus on the individual's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So it really digs into our minds, our cognition, how we process social stuff.
And our emotions in social settings, too. Plus, of course, what we actually do when we interact. Cooperating, helping, conflict, aggression, all of it.
And it's fascinating how those three connect, isn't it? Thoughts influence feelings, feelings drive actions, actions shape thoughts.
It's a complex feedback loop, definitely, and social psychology tries to map that out, but always within that social context.
Which brings us perfectly to the third point, that critical role of the social context. It just hammers home that our actions aren't purely internal. They're heavily shaped by people around us.
Whether they're physically present or not.
Right. Real, remembered, or just implied by the situation. And this is where Kurt Lewin's big idea comes in, right? Behavior is a function of the person and the situation interacting.
Lewin's model, yeah. D equals FPE. It was revolutionary because it moved past that simple nature or nurture debate.
It's not just who you are or where you are.
It's how those two things constantly interact, collide, influence each other. It's dynamic.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me personally. Just realizing that simply thinking about other people, that alone can change what we do.
Exactly. It's not always direct interaction. Our social world gets internalized.
Like we carry around these mental models of others, of norms, what people might expect.
And these internal frameworks are constantly shaping our thoughts, guiding our behavior, even when we're physically alone. It's like having a silent committee meeting in your head sometimes.
Huh. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So, okay, we have a handle on what it is. Let's zoom out a bit and look at the scope. What kinds of things does social psychology actually study?
Well, it centers on individuals within that social landscape, like you said.
Yeah.
Looking at interactions between people and within larger groups.
And the range of topics is pretty huge, right?
It's remarkably broad, yeah. A big one is attitudes. How we form our likes and dislikes, what they're made of, how they change, what purpose they serve.
And crucially, how attitudes link up or don't link up with our actual behavior. That's not always straightforward.
Not at all. Then there's social cognition. Sounds a bit academic, maybe, but it's basically how we think about the social world.
Like how we process information about people, remember things about social events.
Exactly. How we form first impressions, figure out why people do things, that's attribution. And those mental shortcuts, stereotypes, and schemas, they play a big role too.
Okay. What else?
Then there's social influence. Super important area. How do people affect each other's thoughts, feelings, actions?
So conformity going along with the crowd.
Yep. Persuasion, how people change our minds. Obedience, why we follow orders from authority figures. All that falls under social influence.
And then there's the flip side, almost pro-social and anti-social behavior.
Right. Why do we help people sometimes? What drives empathy, liking, love? And then why hostility, aggression, prejudice? It covers the best and, well, the worst of our social interactions.
It seems to cover a lot of fundamental human experiences.
It really does. And finally, a major focus is on social groups and group dynamics. How groups form, their internal workings, the processes within them.
And how being in a group affects the individuals in it, like team performance, leadership stuff.
Precisely. Group composition, structure, how they perform tasks, leadership emergence, all of that.
So, okay, boiling this down.
Yeah.
What does it mean in terms of, like, real-world questions? It sounds like social psychologists are asking things like, why would someone help a stranger?
Or what causes loneliness? Why do we buy certain products?
Are there gender differences in social settings? What makes people care about environmental issues?
Yeah, altruism, consumer choices, prejudice, helping behavior. It's incredibly diverse. It's like looking at the individual threads that make up the whole social fabric.
It really is an expansive field.
And, as we look at how the field developed historically, you can see how these different questions came to the forefront, often driven by real-world events and social issues.
Right. Our sources trace it back pretty far, actually. Some early philosophical ideas, and then this thing in Germany in the mid-1800s called Volker psychology.
Ah, yes, folk psychology.
It sounds like it was trying to understand the psychology of whole groups, like nations, a sort of collective mind idea, trying to see how shared culture, language, traditions shape group thinking.
That's a good way to put it. It wasn't scientific like today, more philosophical, but it did plant the seed of thinking about social and cultural influences on individuals.
Okay, then we jumped to the early 1900s, 1908 specifically. The first proper social psychology textbooks appear, one by McDougall in Britain, one by Ross in America.
But they were different from modern texts, right? More focused on instincts, maybe broad social forces, less on data.
Yeah, reflecting the psychology at the time. But around then, there was also this huge shift towards measuring things systematically. Psychology labs popping up like once.
That push for empirical evidence was critical. And you also had the rise of behaviorism.
Right. John B. Watson around 1913, really pushing for study only what you can see, observable behavior. And Floyd Allport in 1924 was a big champion for making social psychology and experimental science.
Which led to influential works like Experimental Social Psychology by the Murphys.
And we can't forget Mormon Triplets' study back in 1898 that's often called the first social psychology experiment, isn't it?
The one on cyclists, yeah. Social facilitation. Finding people performed better when others were watching or competing. Simple idea, but experimentally tested.
So all these things marked this big shift, moving away from just thinking about stuff toward actually gathering evidence.
Exactly. Speculation to investigation.
Then the 1940s and 50s, the formational years, you have Kurt Lewin, the father of social psychology, really pushing that person-situation interaction idea.
And Leon Festinger, emphasizing rigorous methods, experiments, even using blind participants to avoid bias.
And then World War II seems to have had a massive impact, sparking all this research on conformity.
Sharif and Ash's famous studies.
And obedience to authority, Milgram, Zimbardo. Pretty sobering stuff, grappling with the darker side of social influence.
Definitely. The war made understanding those forces incredibly urgent. Those studies showed, quite disturbingly, how easily situations and social pressures could sway individual behavior.
After that, it seems like the field really expanded its horizons, looking at a much wider range of topics.
Yeah, the expansion period. You get Latane and Darley asking why people don't help in emergencies, the bystander effect.
Berkowitz studying aggression triggers. Yanis looking at groupthink, how groups can make terrible decisions.
And Gordon Allport and Sharif continuing work on intergroup relations, stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination, trying to understand the roots of conflict between groups.
So the field was maturing, tackling more complex social problems, trying to be relevant to the real world.
Absolutely. Then later in the 20th century, a big focus landed on attitudes again, how they work, the thinking behind them.
And persuasion, how advertising works, how opinions get changed. And that link between attitudes and behavior was really under the microscope.
Which brings in Festinger again with cognitive dissonance theory. That's a huge one.
Right, the discomfort we feel when our beliefs and actions don't line up and how we try to resolve that tension, it explains so much.
It really does. And think about how you might justify putting a ton of effort into something you didn't initially enjoy. You convince yourself it was worthwhile to reduce that dissonance.
Oh, yeah, been there. And then technology starts booming, right? Information tech. And that seems to fuel interest in social cognition. Again, how we handle all this social information.
Exactly. Research methods got more sophisticated, cognitive psychology was influential, so we got a deeper look at the mental processes behind social behavior, how we perceive, interpret, remember social stuff.
Plus, researchers started finding flaws in our decision-making. Cognitive biases, motivated reasoning. Kahneman and Tversky's work, for instance.
Showing we're not always the rational actors we like to think we are.
Definitely not. So that brings us more or less up to the 21st century. Where's social psychology heading now?
Well, it keeps expanding. New frontiers like health, happiness, well-being. Also, a lot more integration of evolutionary perspectives and cultural psychology, understanding both our shared human nature and cultural variations.
And social neuroscience actually looking at the brain during social interactions.
Exactly. Using fMRI and other tools to see the neural basis of social thoughts and feelings. It's becoming much more interdisciplinary. Biology, neuroscience, culture studies, all feeding in.
That makes sense for getting a fuller picture. Our sources also mention social psychology in India specifically, starting with a textbook way back in 1928.
Right, Sengupta and Mukherjee. And early work there looked at things like rumors after that big earthquake in Bihar.
Which Festinger later connected to cognitive dissonance, interestingly.
Yeah, and studies on prejudice, caste attitudes, attitude change, intergroup relations, leadership, all relevant to the Indian context.
And more recently, a focus on ethnic identities and what they called indigenous perspectives, like from Nandi and Kakar.
Yes, developing theories and research grounded in the specific cultural and social realities of India, rather than just applying Western models. That's a really important development for a more globally representative psychology.
Okay, so we see how it developed. Now, how does it fit with other fields? Other social sciences, for instance. Anthropology.
Big connection there. Anthropology focuses heavily on culture, and social psychology increasingly recognizes you have to understand the cultural context to understand behavior.
So they complement each other. Anthropology gives the wider cultural lens. Social psychology zooms in on the individual within that culture.
That's a good way to think about it. Then there's economics.
Right, dealing with production, distribution, consumption. How does that link?
Well, think about social exchange theory in social psychology, looking at relationships as costs and benefits. That borrows economic ideas, though economics usually looks at much larger systems.
So it highlights that kind of implicit calculation in our social lives.
Kind of, yeah. Then political science, studying government, political institutions.
The link seems obvious there. Voting behavior, political attitudes, advertising, leadership. Social psychology must have a lot to say about those.
It definitely does. It helps understand the psychology behind political actions and beliefs.
And sociology. Studying societies, groups, how is it different?
The main difference is often the level of analysis. Sociology tends to focus more on the group or society as the unit structures, trends. Social psychology usually focuses on the individual within the group.
But they study similar things sometimes, like prejudice.
Absolutely.
Right.
There's a lot of overlap and ideally fruitful exchange between them. The boundary isn't always sharp.
Okay, what about connections within psychology? Like biological psychology or neuroscience.
Huge connection now, as we mentioned. Social neuroscience, social psychophysiology. Understanding the brain and body links to social thoughts, feelings, behaviors, the biological basis of empathy, aggression, connection.
Right, clinical psychology, that focuses more on abnormal behavior, right?
Yeah.
Social psychology on more typical behavior.
Generally, yes. But there's a lot of exchange. Understanding normal social processes helps clinical psychologists understand deviations. And social psych theories are definitely applied in therapy and understanding mental health social aspects.
Makes sense. Cognitive psychology.
We touched on that huge influence. Cognitive psych studies thought processes like memory, attention. Social psychology borrows those methods and theories heavily to study how we think about our social lives. Social cognition grew right out of that.
And developmental psychology, studying changes across the lifespan.
That informs social psychology, too. How do social behaviors like self-control, emotion regulation, aggression develop? Looking at kids gives clues about the foundations of adult social patterns.
Okay, last one. Personality psychology. Focuses on individual differences, inner traits. That sounds almost like the opposite of social psychology's focus on the situation.
Historically, there was some tension, yeah, person versus situation. But now it's much more integrated. Most researchers acknowledge it's both. Our stable personality traits interact with specific situations to produce behavior.
So that old divide is kind of blurring.
It really is. Both fields see behavior as this dynamic interplay between the person and their environment.
So yeah, definitely not an island. Social psychology is woven into this whole network of disciplines.
Exactly. Each offers a piece of the puzzle. And to understand social psych even better, it helps to think about the different levels it operates on.
Right. The levels of analysis. Our materials mentioned 4. First is the individual-intrapersonal level.
Focusing right on the individual, their unique biology, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, topics like social cognition, attitudes, even social deviance fit here. It's about internal processes.
How we see ourselves, our biases, motivations.
Exactly. Then you zoom out a bit to interpersonal interactions.
So how we influence each other directly. Communication, persuasion.
Cooperation, competition, altruism, aggression, prejudice. All in those face-to-face or small group contexts. The immediate social back and forth.
Okay, level 3.
The interaction between the individual and the group. How groups shape individuals through norms, conformity, socialization, learning the rules, beliefs, language.
But also how individuals can influence the group back, like leadership or sparking change.
Precisely. It's a two-way street. How group membership shapes us and how we shape the group.
And the final level.
Interaction between groups. Now we're looking at dynamics between different social groups. Prejudice again, discrimination, conflict between groups, but also cooperation between them.
So the broadest level. Looking at group identities, large-scale intergroup relations.
That's right. Issues of social identity, harmony, conflict on that bigger scale.
Okay, so bringing this all together, this deep dive, it really shows social psychology as this scientific field trying to figure out how our thoughts, feelings, actions are shaped by the social world.
And it does this by looking at multiple levels, from inside our heads out to interactions between large groups.
And it connects with so many other ways of understanding people, biology, culture, economics, sociology.
It's incredibly interconnected. And what's fascinating is how those levels influence each other. Our inner thoughts affect our interactions, which are shaped by our groups, which relate to other groups. It's a really complex, intricate web.
It really is.
Yeah.
You know, considering just how powerfully our thoughts and actions are swayed by this social world, as we've talked about, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves, our own place in it all?
That's a great question to ponder.
It really makes you think about those constant, often invisible social forces just pushing and pulling at us all the time.